Chapter 21 Progress and Recovery. Summary. Now that they're on their way to getting the ship fixed, they can finally focus on making their lives easier and getting better. After they finally got the ship back to camp, things started to move smoothly. Ochako was able to float it a little ways away from the escape pod, so whatever unholy noises Mei might make working on it don't filter back to the camp. And oh boy was Mei working on it. When the ship was set down, Mei was on it like a cat on catnip, spending the rest of the day sequestered alone with her newest baby, letting strange mutterings fill the unsettlingly quiet forest. And every day after work, Mei would be right back to it. Most days she would drag Izuku along to be her assistant, so she could start educating him in the ways of tech. For the first couple of days, Izuku just felt lost, and left the ship with a slight headache. But as the days dragged on, things began to make more and more sense. They just started to click. He was enjoying it to the point where he was excited to start back up on the ship when Mei got back from work. She didn't yet trust him alone with it, which was fair. And sometimes, when he finished work and Mei was still busy, Mr. Xiantuk would give him a few lessons of his own. Work itself was also going really well. It honestly reminded him of cleaning Daiogaba Beach back home. Sometimes he could even forget he was months away from home on an alien planet. Though, the dump was a lot bigger than the beach. It honestly seemed like a mountain range of trash, but Izuku could still work himself to exhaustion every day. And if he could still move by the time his short shift ended, he would just keep going till he couldn't go any longer. He might not be getting paid, but oftentimes Mr. Xiantuk would join him and give him this one sweet alien drink. Izuku didn't know exactly what it was, but it tasted vaguely like carbonated citrusy grape, and he loved it. He also just needed the muscle mass. Cleaning a beach worked the first time, so he was determined to keep it up. He would regain one for all by the time they left the planet. All he had to do was work for it. Izuku noticed an odd thing seemed to be happening to the Osiers. As time moved on, they started to get taller, especially Fastel, but not in the grow an inch in a year taller, but the grow half an inch in a week taller. When Izuku noticed, he concernedly asked the two what that was about. Apparently, Fastel was right at the age of maturity for their species, and would start growing to their full height, which was around 7 feet? Pyerpa was also behind on growth because of the malnutrition from captivity, so they would be growing some in the coming weeks. Izuku knew most aliens around them were definitely over 7 feet, most closer to 9, but just didn't click that the two kids, who at present were around Kachan's height, would be just as tall. When Fastel was confused by his reaction, they innocently asked him how tall the Terrans would be after their puberty. Izuku just let out an embarrassed sigh, weakly revealing that no, they would not be going through puberty anytime soon as they had already done so. They were basically as tall as they would ever be, give or take a few inches. The number of short jokes that came from the two over the next couple of days only made Izuku sigh harder. When the group next got paid, it was time for a shopping trip. The entirety of their first couple paychecks had gone into the down payment for the ship, so they could start getting working on it as soon as possible. But now they had a little extra to spend. They could finally get some essentials, like clothes. The Terrans' clothes were seriously in dire condition. Even after being cleaned in the river, they were still ingrained with months of filth. The structure of the clothes wasn't doing anything for them either. Because of the massive amount of weight and muscle they lost, everyone's hero costumes just hung limply on their frames, littered with small rips and tears as well as the horribly melted circle from their brandings, which was pretty inconvenient when they were trying to hide the mark. They had healed nicely, coming out to a relatively inconspicuous circle of Raid's shiny off-color skin. The serial numbers were tricky to cover with their loose, drapey clothes, so they were just another of the many reasons they could no longer delay getting new clothes. It took a while to find a shop that had garments in their size. While the town was relatively diverse, most every sentient they saw was much taller and often bulkier than them. They ended up having to get some from the kids section so it would fit, and the options weren't the best. Mina resolved to learn how to sew so they wouldn't have to stoop so low as to wear these fashion atrocities ever again, but did not, in fact, have any idea how to sew. Luckily for her, Mei had dabbled in it when making support gear. But for now, they were stuck with oddly draping clothes in the town's signature pastel colors. After finally replacing their hero costumes and beginning to wear truly clean clothes for the first time in months, they went on to buy some other essentials. They were able to find some cheap pans and cooking gear, some nicer pillows and blankets for sleeping, some good tools and materials for repairing the ship, but it was nothing compared to how great it finally felt to be out of those old, dirty clothes. Like shedding an old skin, full of pain and the faraway past. Izuku finally felt like he was no longer on the trafficker ship, but forging a way home. Izuku woke with a start. Something was off. He could feel it, but he wasn't sure what was wrong. As he blinked the sleep from his eyes, he looked around for what could have caused his sudden return to consciousness. The sky was still dark with night, but the clearing was illuminated by the soft glow of the moons. Gentle light outlined the peacefully sleeping forms of the others, all huddled together in the cuddle puddle. Maybe not all. As Izuku listened, he could hear panting breath coming from the far side of the pile, where he couldn't quite make out who it was lying there. A distressed whine cut out into the silent night, and Izuku immediately knew what was going on. Nightmares. Back on Earth, he was no stranger to them. No one in his class was. They had all been through too much to not be plagued by the occasional, or nightly, nightmare. But since the abduction, things had only gotten worse. When the Ostiers learned about the Terrans' night terrors, the first time the whole group was woken up by ragged screaming, it turned out that this was yet another amazing feature exclusive to Terrans. Being plagued by imaginary visions while one was supposed to be at rest was strange enough, but the fact that they could induce such strong negative emotions as to wake one up in a panic was a whole other level of messed up, apparently. Still, that didn't change the fact that it happened. Some had it worse than others. Izuku had been having nightmares of being back in that cage almost every night, while Mina only had one night terror since escaping. Oddly enough, none of the Terrans had really seemed to have this level of nightmares while still imprisoned on the trafficker ship. Maybe it was because even the familiarity of their normal nightmares was comforting compared to the reality every second of every day. Even being face to face with Shigaraki in his dreams did nothing to damper the sense of comfort Izuku got from a familiar face, and the idea that he may see his loved ones again. But now that they were out, the idea of being back in that hell was more than enough ammo for their cruel brains to throw at them. And it seemed that one of the group was experiencing that very thing right now. Izuku sleepily slipped out from under Mina's sprawled-out form and crept silently around the group, towards whoever was in distress. It wasn't the first time he had been woken up since they began sleeping in their group cuddle puddle, and he's sure it wouldn't be the last. They are all each other has, after all, so of course Izuku would be there for whoever needed him. He knows they would do the same. But, as he rounded the other side of the pile, he saw that the person was someone he'd never comforted before. Izuku knew that Kachan had bad night terrors. He'd even opened up a little about how he had nightly nightmares after being kidnapped by the League of Villains. He'd opened up about a lot of things back then, on the ship, though he'd closed himself right back off after escaping. Not quite as closed off as on Earth, but closed off nonetheless. Even so, Izuku had never seen Kachan in the throes of a nightmare, and from the sounds of it, it was a bad one. He had never heard Kachan make noises like this before. A keen of distress escaped his lips in a way that he never would have allowed if he was awake, alongside desperate, mumbling pleas. He had curled in on himself at the very edge of the pile. Sweat was dripping down his brow, and his eyes were scrunched in pain. Izuku reached a tentative hand towards Kachan. He knew it was better to be woken up than stay trapped in whatever hell his mind had dreamed up for him tonight, but it had to be done gently. After a few minutes of comforting whispers and nudging, Katsuki finally woke up with a sob. It was a heart-wrenching noise that only pulled at Izuku's heart further, when tears started to slip down Kachan's pale cheeks. He curled up even further as his arms wrapped around to hug himself. "Kachan?" Izuku delicately said. At the sound, Katsuki's head shot up, and he locked his teary red eyes with Izuku's empathetic green. "Izuku," Katsuki brokenly spoke, as his hand reached out to touch him, almost like he was testing to see if he was really there. Izuku's eyes widened in shock at the sound of his given name. The times he heard it come from Kachan's mouth were few and far between, ever since he'd been dubbed Deku so many years ago. Whatever Kachan's dream, it had to have been really bad if it had him breaking down like this. Reaching his own scarred hand out the rest of the way to meet Kachan's, he pulled both back to himself, glad when Kachan seemed to relax at the contact. Izuku spoke out softly once again. "I'm here, Kachan. It's okay. You're safe. Everyone's safe." The tension in his muscles seemed to leak out at the declaration, but he didn't move. Katsuki just continued to stare dazedly into Izuku's eyes for the next couple of minutes. Tears slowly dried as he came back to himself, bit by bit. When it finally looked like Kachan had fully returned from wherever his mind was, Izuku was half expecting him to pull back, maybe even stomp off into the wilderness alone until he had calmed down. But he didn't. Instead, Kachan just deflated right into Izuku's arms. Even more time passed in silence, as the two just sat in each other's company. Katsuki was slumped over top Izuku, and Izuku's arms wrapped comfortingly around Katsuki. But eventually, Izuku broke the silence. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked in a quiet whisper. "It always helps me after a nightmare when I have someone there, just to listen." For a breath, Katsuki was silent, before he let out a wet sigh into Izuku's shirt. I couldn't do anything," Kachan shakily began. "They were there, and I couldn't do anything." Izuku let out a soft hum of acknowledgement before Katsuki continued. "You were standing just out of reach, and I couldn't get to you. You looked so scared, and I couldn't save you. They took you again, but this time I wasn't with you. I couldn't protect you. You were just gone, and I was alone." The tears were back, but not just from Katsuki this time. Bakugo wasn't good at telling people he cared. And Izuku was sure Kachan would be on himself in the morning for this level of vulnerability. But in the moment, Izuku couldn't bring himself to care. He just held Kachan tighter as they both cried. "I'm not going anywhere, Kachan," Izuku wetly said. "They are never going to get us again. And even if they do come, you're not alone. You don't have to protect everyone on your own. We're all here, and we'll all be ready to help each other. And anyway, if anything ever happened, I know you'd get me back. no matter what. So don't worry about it, Kachan. Eventually, they fell asleep in each other's arms, and when they awoke the next day, Izuku was right. Kachan threatened to blow him up if he ever spoke a word of last night to anyone, but the threats were empty. Izuku wasn't sure Kachan even realized how close to Izuku and the rest of the group he was for the next couple of days. Izuku hoped one day he'd be able to get it through that spiky blonde head of his, that nothing that happened was his fault, just like Kamino. He wasn't alone. But for now, he just let his little blonde protector do whatever made him feel better. And if it made Izuku feel safer as well, no one had to know. Katsuki's body felt floaty, like he wasn't all there. But his feet felt like they had been dipped in wet cement, weighing him down to the earth. The trees around him were a muted swamp green, so unlike the bright emerald eyes filled with fear in front of him. Across the field before him, so close yet so far away at the same time, was Deku. And behind him, with their segmented digits wrapped around the back of his neck, was one of the cockroach traffickers. They had found him in their safe forest grove, and they had Deku. Yet there was nothing he could do about it. Again. Katsuki willed his body forward, but it just wouldn't listen. His heavy, uncoordinated steps lumbered closer, but the aliens just moved farther and farther back, with Deku in tow. Where were the others? Had they been taken? Were they just out, going about their day and not knowing anything was wrong, only to return to find that Deku was gone and Katsuki hadn't protected him? Would they blame him? They should. He was useless. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to catch up to him, to protect him from his kidnappers. This was the second time Deku was going to be taken right in front of Katsuki without a real fight. But this time, they were leaving Katsuki behind. He wouldn't be there to protect him from whatever came next. He would be left behind to forever live with the knowledge that he wasn't good enough to save him. Katsuki looked back one last time at Izuku's face before the shuttle door closed. Those big green eyes, so full of fear, but also betrayal. It was Katsuki's fault. He wasn't good enough. The first thing he felt was a soft rocking, like a boat out in the calm morning waves of the ocean. Then, comforting whispers filtered into his ears, but he didn't deserve to be comforted. Not after what he let happen to Izuku. He felt a strangled sob escape from his tight throat, despite his efforts to clamp down on the sound. He didn't deserve to cry. He didn't deserve to feel bad. But his body didn't listen to his brain. He could feel cool tears trailing down his cheeks and shuddered as his body curled in on itself. Then, a clear voice whispered out into the darkness. Kachan? Immediately, his head shot up and he was face to face with Izuku. But unlike what felt like moments before, his eyes were not filled with the all-encompassing terror, but a kind, soft something. Before he even realized, he had outstretched a hand towards the greenette, and a hoarse whisper left his mouth. Izuku. He was here. He was here, and he was safe. It was just a nightmare. Just another nightmare. Izuku was okay. Katsuki barely processed the scarred hand reaching out to grab his, before warm fingers curled around his calloused ones. Their intertwined hands were brought right over Izuku's heart, where it beat steadily beneath his hand. Alive. Okay. Not a trace of terror in those blinding green eyes. Izuku spoke softly to the cool night air. I'm here, Kachan. It's okay. You're safe. Everyone is safe. Safe. Everyone was safe. He could see it in his eyes, full of so much love and light. Katsuki wouldn't let anyone take it away. But as he felt the tears slowly dry from his eyes, he couldn't bring himself to move. So instead, he just slumped forward into Izuku's arms. Safe. But eventually, Izuku broke the comforting silence. Do you want to talk about it? It always helps me after a nightmare when I have someone there, just to listen. The small part of his brain that was still able to feel any sense of pride was screaming at him to leave without a word. But his emotion over one brain won out. He could hear the shake of his voice as he started to speak. I couldn't do anything. They were here and I couldn't do anything. A soft hum urged him to continue. You were standing just out of reach, and I couldn't get to you. You look so scared. You look so scared, but I couldn't save you. And they took you again. But this time, I wasn't with you. I couldn't protect you. You were just gone. And I was alone. He could feel the tears were back, blurring his vision ever so slightly, but not too much to see the green eyes that looked back at him, filled with diamond-like tears that sparkled in the moonlight. Big, almost Ghibli-esque. Izuku was always known for crying, after all, but it seemed like Katsuki was faring no better. Strong arms wrapped around his tired body, drawing him into the other's chest. A wet voice spoke, so carefully and quietly, Katsuki wasn't sure he was hearing it at first. I'm not going anywhere, Kachan. They're never going to get us again. And even if they do come, you're not alone. You don't have to protect everyone on your own. We're all here. We'll all be ready to help each other. And anyway, if anything ever happened, I know you'd get me back, no matter what. So don't worry about it, Kachan. He couldn't help but bury himself even deeper into Izuku's chest. Everything would be okay. He was safe. They were all safe. He wasn't alone anymore.